Picture this. Jane Foole, the Tudor court jester, paraded before nobles in fine gowns and expensive shoes, yet her head shaved bare, her laughter bought, her dignity traded for amusement. Or Mathurine of France, who once saved a condemned man's life, not with a sword, but with a joke. That was the power and the peril of being a female jester. Congratulations, you've just been chosen, not because of your dazzling resume, but because the court thought you looked funny in a wig. Before we step into the strange, glittering, and humiliating world of jesters tonight, a quick note. If you'd like to listen without ads, offline, and with a bonus insider episode, you can find the ad-free collection linked in the description and pinned comment. So settle in, dim the lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and let the bells of history guide you gently towards sleep. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. And if you don't subscribe, these women vanish from history all over again. Don't let that happen. So you found yourself in a medieval court. Congratulations. You could have been a laundress, forever bent over icy water, or a servant polishing pewter until your reflection looked back at you like a ghost. But no, you've been chosen for something far stranger, to be a female jester. Already you should know, that was not exactly a common career path. Jesters were everywhere, in one form or another. The Romans had their comic actors. The Chinese had witty tricksters who toyed with emperors. In India, performers used humor as both devotion and social commentary. Every society had people who turned laughter into survival. But women were supposed to keep their jokes to themselves. If you were female, your role was to be silent, obedient, and preferably invisible unless you were birthing heirs or pouring wine. Making fun of kings and nobles was not in the official handbook of womanhood, and yet, some women managed to slip through the cracks of expectation. They became jesters. Not many, not often, but enough to leave faint traces in history. Take Archwood de Poix, for example. She was the personal fool to Queen Jane of France in the late 14th century. Imagine that. A woman allowed to be funny in public, to insult nobles, to spar with wit at a royal table, and not be dragged out by guards. Jeanne paid her handsomely, even going so far as to gift her dresses worth 170 gold francs. That wasn't pocket change. That was the kind of wardrobe fit for a duchess. Yet Archwood wasn't parading as a noblewoman. She was kept as an amusing contradiction, dressed like wealth, treated like folly, remembered as an ornament of wit. Then there's Mathurine of France, perhaps the most famous female jester in Europe. She worked for Henry IV in the late 1500s and became something of a legend. Known for dressing in outlandish costumes, think harlequin colors and dramatic hats, she wielded her wit like a weapon. Once, when a man condemned to death begged for his life, Mathurine intervened. She turned her joke into a plea, persuading the king to spare him. Of course, she made sure to charge a fee for her trouble. Survival was always transactional. But she did something extraordinary. She showed that the fool wasn't just a clown in the corner. She could shape decisions. She could save lives. And then we returned to England, to the Tudor court, where the strange figure of Jane Foole wanders through records. Jane served 3 queens, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Parr, and Mary Tudor. Imagine her presence, head-shaved bald, dressed in expensive gowns and shoes that rivaled the queen's wardrobe. There's something both tragic and surreal about that image. A woman mocked for her oddity, yet dressed finer than half the nobility. She was lavished with clothes not out of respect, but because her appearance was part of the entertainment. Her shaved head marked her as other, Her laughter was demanded, and yet she was threaded into the royal family portraits, always on the margins, yet impossible to erase. Now, before you get comfortable, remember this. These women weren't ordinary entertainers. A minstrel could sing a ballad. A dancer could perform and bow. But a female fool had to mock, juggle, sing, and survive, all while walking a knife edge of gender politics. You, in their shoes, probably one of Jane Foole's many pairs, would have lived as a paradox. You were both valued and ridiculed. Queens kept you close because you were a rare luxury, a woman who could say the unsayable. Kings tolerated you because you wrapped your commentary in comedy, but no one, not once, saw you as an equal. This is why female fools are so rare in the records. Most women who spoke too boldly were silenced through exile, punishment, or whispers of witchcraft. But as a fool, you had immunity. You could make the king laugh at himself without losing your head. Well, not immediately. The very costume you wore, ridiculous and humiliating as it was, served as armor. It said, "Don't take me seriously." Which was, of course, the perfect disguise to say something deadly serious. Picture yourself in that court, the air heavy with incense, nobles lounging in embroidered silks, the table groaning under roasted meats. A hush falls as the queen gestures for her fool. That's you. Every eye turns. Your dress is brightly mismatched. Your sleeves jingle with bells. They expect a jest, something sharp, maybe even scandalous. And here's the truth. They will laugh. They will laugh louder than they should, not because your wit is unmatched, but because your humiliation reassures them of their superiority. And yet between the bells and the satire, you can slip in a truth, a jab at the king's failing policy, a joke about the treasury, a mockery of a noble's greed. You're not just entertainment, you're commentary. And that, dear listener, is dangerous. Archwood de Poix, Mathurine, Jane Foole. They were not celebrated poets or playwrights. They were not meant to leave legacies, but they lived at the heart of power, closer to monarchs than most ministers, with the right to speak in ways even bishops feared. Their names survive precisely because they defied the silence expected of women. Of course, their lives weren't glamorous. They were tools of survival, paraded, mocked, laughed at, and occasionally beaten. But in rare moments, they wielded something no noblewoman could, the freedom to make a king uncomfortable. So who were the female jesters? They were the anomalies, the outliers, the women who found loopholes in a system designed to silence them. They dressed in motley, carried baubles, and jingled with bells. They were ridiculed and humiliated, but they spoke. And sometimes, when the joke was sharp enough, they were heard. So, how exactly do you end up as a female jester? Let's be honest, no little girl in medieval Europe ever said, "When I grow up, I'd like to shave my head, wear bells on my elbows, and make jokes until I die." Yet somehow, here you are, bells jingling faintly with every step. The truth is that women came into the role of jester through two main doors, neither of which were gilded. The first door was labeled natural fool. That meant you weren't trained, you weren't polished, you were simply born different. Maybe you had a disability, a deformity, or a mind that worked in a way others found strange. In a peasant family, that could mean disaster. Poverty was already crushing, and a child who couldn't work the fields or marry well was considered a burden. And so, in a cruel twist of survival, some families offered daughters with visible quirks or disabilities to wealthy patrons as fools. Better fed at court, they reasoned, than left to starve in a cottage. Imagine that reality. You, a young girl, taken from the smoky hearth of your village home and placed in the glittering halls of nobility, not as a guest, but as a curiosity. Instead of being scolded for your odd laughter or peculiar looks, now those traits are currency. Nobles clap and chuckle, not out of kindness, but because your difference is entertaining. You've gone from being a burden to being a performance. The second door was labeled artificial fool. These were women who weren't born into the role, but who had the wit, the timing, and the recklessness to pull it off. Some were minstrels or performers, singers, jugglers, dancers, who found themselves elevated from the tavern stage to the royal hall. Others may have been companions to queens who discovered that making people laugh, often at great risk, was a way to stay in favor. If you had a quick tongue and the nerve to use it, you could cross a line no other woman could even approach. Now, here's the irony. For some women, becoming a fool was one of the only routes to independence. Think about it. Most women in the Middle Ages had two options: be controlled by your father or be controlled by your husband. But as a jester, strange as it sounds, you were paid, clothed, and sometimes even granted freedom to travel. You weren't tied to a spinning wheel or a plow. You had, in your own bizarre way, leverage. Of course, independence came wrapped in humiliation. If you were a natural fool, your survival meant exaggerating your differences. If your back was hunched, you leaned into it, bowing dramatically. If your speech was odd, you turned it into a comic routine. And if you were simply eccentric, you allowed nobles to point, laugh, and call it entertainment. The very things that once brought you shame were now a mask, and you wore it because the alternative was hunger. If you were an artificial fool, the danger was sharper. Your value wasn't your deformity, it was your wit. And wit could be deadly. One poorly placed joke could offend the wrong lord, or worse, the king himself. Yet these women walked that tightrope every day. They had to be just sharp enough to amuse, but not sharp enough to wound. For a woman to do that in a hall filled with men who believed they were divinely chosen rulers, that was no small feat. Think about Jane Foole again. She may have been a natural fool, noted for her shaved head and eccentricities, yet she lived in palaces, wore gowns gifted by queens, and dined at the fringes of royal banquets. Compare her life to that of an ordinary Tudor woman, bent over bread ovens or childbirth. Which fate was kinder? Which fate was crueler? It's hard to say. And then there's Mathurine, the French jester whose humor saved lives. She was no simpleton. She dressed in elaborate costumes, sparred verbally with nobles, and turned her wit into influence. For her, the role of fool was a mask, one that allowed her to speak truths disguised as laughter. She wasn't born into it, she chose it, or perhaps was chosen because her boldness couldn't be contained elsewhere. Either way, she made the costume work for her, not the other way around. So, if you're picturing yourself in this world, here's the decision you never actually got to make. Are you a natural fool, or are you an artificial one? If you were born into a poor family with quirks that drew stares, the court might scoop you up, shave your head, and put you in motley. If you had quick wit and nerves of steel, you might catch the attention of a queen or noble who found your sharp tongue amusing enough to keep you around. Either way, you didn't climb into this role. It dragged you in one way or another. And here's the strangest truth. In a rigid world where women's voices were silenced, fools, especially female fools, were given a platform. It was precarious, humiliating, and dangerous, but it was a platform all the same. Every time you opened your mouth, you risked everything, but you were heard. That's how women ended up as jesters, through desperation, accident, or sheer audacity. Some laughed their way into court. Some were pushed there by poverty. Some turned their eccentricities into survival. And all of them discovered the same paradox, that to be a fool was, ironically, the only way a woman could sometimes speak the truth. And if you just listen without subscribing, you're no different from the courtiers who laughed, clapped, and then forgot her the moment she left the hall. You arrive at court, not as a noble, not as a guest, not even as a servant. No, your title is fool. And here's the thing about being a female jester. You never get to clock out. There is no off switch, no end of shift. You are, at all hours, entertainment on legs. You might think that sounds manageable. Perform a few jokes at dinner, sing a tune, dance awkwardly in your jingling sleeves, and then retreat to your chambers. But no, you are not here to relax in your own corner. You are here to be available, at all times, in all moods, for all whims. The queen cannot sleep? Call the fool. The king is brooding about taxes? Call the fool. The banquet is dragging? Call the fool. Someone just spilled wine on the tapestry? Call the fool. You are a human diversion button, pressed whenever the atmosphere needs rearranging. That's why historians often note, jesters lived at the very heart of the palace. Your bedchamber, if you're lucky enough to have one, is not tucked away in some quiet attic. It's usually near the kitchens or the great hall, close enough that if a monarch snaps their fingers, you can be dragged out half-dressed to perform. Sleep lightly, because a knock on the door might come at any hour. And you'll be expected to be funny, even if you're coughing or grieving or sick to your stomach. It's in moments like this you realize you're not a guest of the palace. You're the furniture that talks. A candlestick doesn't get privacy. A rug doesn't get sick leave. And neither do you. Now, for a woman, this lack of privacy had an extra sting. Courtiers might tolerate a male fool slinking into the kitchens for a mug of ale. But a female fool? Every movement was scrutinized. Nobles would comment on your dress, your laughter, the way you sat. You were both visible and invisible. Visible when they wanted amusement, invisible when they wanted to ignore your humanity. And yet, here's the fascinating part. You had a razor's edge to walk. You were required to be a harmless amusement, and yet your value came from being more than harmless. Anyone could tell a joke. What made a jester, especially a female jester, important was the ability to slip in commentary, to say what no one else dared say. Think of Jane Foole in Tudor England. She was always there, in paintings, at banquets, hovering at the edge of the royal family. Her bald head, her absurd clothes, her forced laughter, all marked her as different. But by being different, she could speak. She could mock courtiers or comment on the queen's temper. She could remind powerful people of truths they wanted to forget. And because she was just a fool, no one could accuse her of treason, at least not immediately. Or picture Mathurine of France. Dressed in motley, her voice sharp and clever, she played both entertainer and advisor. One moment she was dancing for nobles, the next she was persuading Henry IV to grant mercy. To the courtiers she was an oddity. To the king she was an indispensable pressure valve. That was the paradox. You lived every day as a joke, but the truth hidden in your words could move mountains or save lives. But don't mistake this for freedom. You never controlled when to speak or when to rest. You were summoned at whim. Imagine sitting in your chamber, finally alone, finally allowing your face to fall into exhaustion. Suddenly, a knock at the door. You're needed. The queen is irritable. The banquet is dull. You shuffle back in, the bells on your sleeves betraying your presence before you even open your mouth. And then, before a room full of people who don't see you as an equal, you must smile. You must sparkle. You must transform sorrow into satire. Here's the kicker. You don't even own your own identity. You are not Jane or Mathurine or Archwood. You are the Fool. That title follows you like a curse. It's what defines you in every conversation. Even when you're not performing, you are still the Fool. You cannot put the mask down because the mask is you. And if you're imagining that this came with moments of camaraderie or kindness, think again. Yes, queens sometimes gifted fools dresses, even luxurious ones. Yes, kings might protect a fool from execution when others would face the axe. But this was not affection. It was possession. You were part of the court's set of curiosities, like a prized hunting dog or an exotic bird, fed, clothed, paraded, laughed at. Still, you found ways to survive. You turned lack of privacy into a kind of armor. By always being present, you became part of the scenery. Nobles forgot you were listening, forgot you were watching. You slipped into shadows, absorbing secrets, gathering knowledge. And when the moment was right, you wrapped that knowledge in humor and tossed it into the air. They laughed, never realizing the knife of truth was hidden inside the joke. So there you are, in the palace halls, the furniture that talks. You are summoned like a toy, mocked like a puppet, but you are also indispensable. Without you, banquets grow stale, queens grow restless, and kings fester in their tempers. Your humiliation oils the wheels of power, and your commentary, buried in laughter, is the one reminder to rulers that even they can be ridiculous. That's the paradox of being a female jester at court. Always on display, never allowed privacy. Yet in your very visibility, you wield a strange, dangerous power. The ability to speak truths that no one else dares utter. Now that you're fully settled into your new role as a female jester, it's time to discuss your uniform. And make no mistake, it is not designed to flatter you. It is not meant to make you feel regal or dignified. The jester's costume was a performance in itself, stitched together to mark you as different, ridiculous, and perpetually available for mockery. Let's start with the basics. The motley. The word itself has slipped into our language to mean a hodgepodge, a mismatch. And that's exactly what you were wearing. Bright, clashing fabrics, reds slammed up against greens, yellows beside blues, stitched deliberately without harmony. The goal was chaos, not beauty. Your outfit announced you before you even spoke. "Here comes nonsense," the colors shouted. "And nonsense has bells." Ah, yes, the bells. Little jingling things sewn into your sleeves, hems, and sometimes even your shoes. Imagine trying to sneak a quiet moment in a palace corridor, only to betray yourself with a soft jingle at every step. You were, quite literally, never silent. Your humiliation echoed around the halls, and nobles loved it, because it meant you couldn't forget your role, even when you desperately wanted to. Now, for women, this costume carried an extra sting. Picture yourself standing beside the queen. She's draped in velvet, her gown heavy with gold thread and pearls. Her hair is carefully styled, her shoes soft kid leather. And you? You're in motley, a patchwork of garish colors, a hat topped with donkey ears or rooster combs. perhaps even a bauble in your hand, basically a puppet of yourself, carved to mock your own face. You're not just an entertainer, you're a walking contradiction to courtly elegance. Take the case of Jane Foole, the Tudor fool who served multiple queens. Records show she was lavished with clothing, sometimes even more pairs of shoes than anyone else at court besides the queen herself. Shoes, dozens of them, silk, velvet, leather, all tailored for her. At first, this sounds like a luxury, but think about the irony. The most finely dressed woman at court was also the one shaved bald and laughed at for her oddities. Nobles adored the sight of Jane in gowns that rivaled their own because it highlighted the absurdity of her position. The finery wasn't dignity, it was decoration. A silk ribbon tied around ridicule. And then, of course, there was the hat. Oh, the hat. The classic jester's cap we all imagine today, with its 3 floppy points, each tipped with a bell. Those 3 points weren't random. They were meant to echo the donkey ears and tail that fools wore in earlier centuries. So yes, your headgear is essentially an homage to a braying animal. Congratulations. Every time you tilt your head, you jingle like livestock. Let's pause here and imagine the scene together. You step into the great hall, the scent of roast meat thick in the air, candles flickering in sconces. The nobles look up. The queen glides in silk. The courtiers gleam in jewels. And you clatter forward in mismatched stockings, bells jingling, a grin stitched onto your face whether you feel like smiling or not. You are the visual joke before you've spoken a word. The costume wasn't just clothing, it was control. It stripped away your individuality and replaced it with caricature. You couldn't blend into the background. You couldn't slip away unnoticed. Your very appearance shouted, "I exist only for your amusement." And yet, here's the paradox. It also gave you power. Because you looked so absurd, so obviously foolish, you were dismissed as harmless. And in that dismissal, you found freedom. You could say things others couldn't. You could mock the Duke's greed, or tease the Queen about her spending. They laughed, because how could anyone take you seriously in such ridiculous clothes? But beneath the bells, your words carried weight. Still, the humiliation clung to every thread. You didn't choose this costume. It was chosen for you. And you wore it not just at feasts or festivals, but every day. Imagine waking up, pulling on the same motley tunic, and knowing that your identity is stitched into its seams. You are not Jane. You are not Mathurine. You are not Archwood. You are the fool, and the outfit makes sure no one forgets it. Sarcasm aside, your survival really did depend on those bells. They reminded nobles that you were there to entertain, not to threaten. They gave your presence a sound, a rhythm, a reassurance that you knew your place. Don't trip on your bells. They're the thin line between laughter and punishment. Even props became part of the humiliation. You might carry a bauble, a little mock scepter topped with a carved head, often a grotesque version of your own. Imagine waving a puppet of yourself, grinning as the court chuckles at the spectacle. Or perhaps you held a bladder on a stick, a silly rattle filled with peas, designed for slapstick comedy. All of it underscored the same message. You're not here to be dignified. You're here to be laughed at. And yet, again, the contradiction remains. Because in this ridiculous costume, you could say the unsayable. The bells gave you cover. The motley was armor. No one suspected the fool of wielding truth, and so the truth could slip through disguised as nonsense. But as you stand there, a patchwork of humiliation in human form, it's worth remembering. The costume wasn't just cloth, It was a cage. It marked you as property. It ensured that everyone who looked at you remembered your place. And even as you performed, even as you twisted satire into survival, you could never take it off. So don't stumble. Keep those bells jingling. Smile as the courtiers laugh. Because in this palace, your survival really does depend on looking and sounding like a fool. So, now you're dressed in motley, your bells are jingling, and the hall is watching. You open your mouth, and here comes the hardest part of all, saying things no one else dares say. This is what historians call the jester's privilege. It sounds grand, doesn't it? Like some noble right written into law, but don't be fooled. It wasn't an official privilege stamped by parchment or protected by royal decree. It was more like a custom, a fragile agreement. You, the fool, could speak truths that everyone else was too afraid to voice, as long as those truths were disguised as jokes. And that's the dangerous game you're playing. Every line you deliver is a gamble. Make the joke sharp enough to sting, but not sharp enough to wound. Poke fun at the king's spending, but don't insult his authority. Tease the courtier's vanity, but don't make them feel humiliated. It's like dancing blindfolded on a knife's edge, while the entire palace leans in, waiting to see if you fall. For a female jester, the game was even riskier. Male fools already walked a thin line. Women tiptoed along an invisible thread. A man mocking a duke could be forgiven. Boys will be boys, after all. But a woman mocking a nobleman? That bordered on scandal. Women were not supposed to laugh at men, much less make men laugh at themselves. And yet that's exactly what you were expected to do. Picture this. The great hall is filled with courtiers, their goblets full, their egos fuller. You're called forward. The duke who struts about in jeweled robes is preening as usual. You toss out a line. My lord, I see you've polished your rings. Pity you left your wits unpolished. Laughter ripples through the crowd. The duke laughs too, because he has to. He can't look thinner-skinned than a woman in bells. But beneath the laughter, his pride stings. You've struck a nerve. That's the point. But what if he doesn't laugh? What if the joke falls flat, or worse, cuts too close? Suddenly the room is cold. The queen's lips press tight. The king's eyes narrow. A single bad joke, and you could be banished from court, beaten, or even executed. History is full of fools who spoke too boldly and paid the price. For you, the female fool, the risk doubled. You had no rank to shield you. You couldn't fall back on brotherhood or military service. Your power was entirely in your performance, and if the performance faltered, so did your safety. And yet, this was also your strange advantage. Because you were a fool, everything you said could be brushed off as nonsense. You could slide criticism under the guise of wit. No minister could say to the king, "You are being reckless with the treasury." But you could. All you had to do was rhyme it, jiggle your bells, and they'd roar with laughter. They laughed at you, yes, but they also laughed at themselves. That is the paradox of jester's privilege. The costume stripped you of dignity, but gave your words teeth. Wrapped in satire, truths could sneak past the guards of pride. Take Mathurine of France. She had a gift for weaving humor into politics. Once, she turned her wit into mercy, persuading King Henry IV to spare a man's life. A woman in motley, with a sharp tongue and sharper timing, succeeded where ministers failed. But imagine the risk. If the king had been in the wrong mood, her plea might have been taken as insolence. She could have ended up imprisoned, or worse. Instead, She laughed her way through the danger and survived. Or think again of Jane Foole in Tudor England. She lived through Anne Boleyn's glittering rise and brutal fall, through Catherine Parr's cautious reign, through Mary Tudor's stormy temper. Each queen kept Jane at her side. Why? Because she could say the things no lady-in-waiting dared. She could mock a courtier, ease a queen's nerves, or even lighten a king's mood. Her head may have been shaved, her dignity stripped, but her tongue had an edge. Now, imagine yourself in that role. You're standing at a feast. The hall is restless. Tension thickens the air. The king has lost a battle, or raised taxes, or quarreled with his ministers. No one dares mention it, but you can. You let the truth slip out in a joke. At least the treasury is lighter now. It saves the servants from back pain carrying it. The hall bursts into laughter. The king chuckles, shaking his head. Crisis diffused. You've survived another night. But you also know, one wrong step, and you'll be the crisis. It's a dangerous privilege, this ability to speak the unspeakable. It gave fools, especially women, a voice in a world determined to silence them. But the price was constant vigilance. Every performance could be your last. Every laugh was a shield. Every groan could be a death sentence. So here you are, bells jingling, a smile plastered on your face, your mind racing faster than your words. You're not just telling jokes. You're navigating politics, soothing tempers, keeping your own head attached to your shoulders. You're playing the most dangerous game of all, survival through laughter. And as you bow to the laughter of the court, you remind yourself of the rule carved into the life of every fool. Say anything you like, as long as it's funny enough to forgive. But here's the thing. You've listened this far. Don't be the courtier who laughs, then walks away. Hit subscribe and prove you actually heard them. By now, you've probably realized something. Being a fool wasn't a safe job. But being a female fool? That was survival on hard mode. A male jester could get away with more. He could tease a duke about his belly or poke fun at a king's thinning hair, and most of the time he'd escape with a chuckle or a slap on the wrist. But you're a woman, and that changes the entire game. Every joke you make carries twice the weight and twice the risk. Picture the scene. You're standing before the court, bells jingling softly, your grin fixed. The nobleman across the table is preening in his jewels, and you deliver a quip that makes the entire hall erupt in laughter. The men are chuckling. The ladies are hiding smiles behind their fans. The nobleman himself laughs too, but in his eyes there's something else. Resentment, shame, because you didn't just make fun of him. You made fun of him as a woman, and that, in this world, was almost unforgivable. See, society had rules, strict ones. Men ruled, women obeyed. Men spoke, women listened. For a woman to mock a man in public was to turn the order of things upside down. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a challenge. And in an age where pride was sharper than steel, challenges were dangerous. And yet, that was your job, to laugh at men, to poke at their vanity, to say the things no one else dared. You were expected to tiptoe along that razor's edge, turning insults into humor, bruised egos into laughter. You had to make fun of powerful men without making them feel powerless. It was a delicate balance, like juggling knives while blindfolded. But here's the twist. When you crossed the line, the punishment wasn't just anger. For women, there was another threat lurking in the shadows, accusations of witchcraft. Think about it. A man could make a biting remark, and people would grumble about insolence. A woman, on the other hand, who seemed too clever, too sharp, too quick with her tongue, that was suspicious, unnatural, dangerous. Your wit could easily be recast as sorcery. After all, how else could a woman cut down a duke with just a sentence? Clearly, the devil must be whispering in your ear. History is littered with stories of women who dared to be outspoken and were branded witches for it. You weren't safe from that stain. Every clever remark carried the risk of being twisted into scandal. She mocked me, therefore she must be cursed. It sounds absurd, but in a world obsessed with order, any woman who upset the balance was suspect. So how did you survive? You learned the art of balancing wit with submission. The trick was to laugh at yourself as much as at them, to soften every jab with a self-deprecating smile. You mocked the Duke's vanity, then followed it up with a joke about your own bells, or your bald head, or your ridiculous shoes. You reminded them that you were the fool, the lowest of the low. That way, they could laugh at you while laughing at themselves. The sting of your words was dulled by the spectacle of your humiliation. In other words, you turned yourself into a cushion. The court's bruised egos fell onto you, and you absorbed the blow. Imagine it. You tease a lord about his gambling losses. The laughter grows sharp. The lord's face darkens. Quickly, you twirl, jingle your bells, and tumble clumsily to the floor. The hall roars. Suddenly, the joke isn't about the lord anymore. It's about you, sprawled like a clown. You've shifted the laughter back onto yourself, protecting your position. You look ridiculous, but you live to jest another day. This was the female jester's constant tightrope. Mockery softened with submission, truth buried in self-humiliation. You gave the court what it wanted, laughter, while keeping yourself alive. Think again of Mathurine of France. She mocked men boldly, sometimes fiercely. But she also played the part of spectacle, dressing in outrageous costumes, exaggerating her role, always reminding the court that she was just the fool. That self-parody kept her safe, even as her wit carved sharp truths. And consider Jane Foole, shaved bald, dressed in fine gowns, paraded before the Tudor queens. She was the living embodiment of self-mockery. Her very appearance screamed contradiction. Her fine shoes mocked the idea of dignity. Her shaved head mocked the idea of beauty. She was a walking reminder that she could be laughed at, which allowed her to slip comments that others couldn't. But don't mistake this for freedom. It wasn't freedom. It was strategy. A survival mechanism in a court where one wrong word could cost your life. You learned to disarm men not with swords, but with laughter. To bow while you cut. To jest while you submitted. To hide razor-sharp wit behind a mask of bells. So, if you're imagining yourself in that role, remember this. Your tongue was your weapon, but also your greatest danger. Every joke was a gamble. Every laugh was a shield. And every smile you wore was part disguise, part protection. For men, jesting was a privilege. For women, it was double jeopardy. You weren't just balancing humor and offense. You were balancing gender, suspicion, and survival. One false step, and the laughter could turn into whispers. Whispers could turn into accusations, and accusations in that world could turn into fire. So you laugh, you bow, you mock, and then you mock yourself. You keep the balance because balance is the only thing standing between you and disaster. That was the price of being a female jester. Every word was a performance, every laugh a calculation, every truth a risk. The banquet hall is glowing tonight. Candles flicker in iron sconces, the light catching on golden goblets and polished platters. The smell of roast meat clings to the air, pork glazed in honey, venison dripping with fat, bread warm from the oven. Minstrels strum in the corner, their music nearly drowned out by the sound of drunken laughter. Nobles lean back in their chairs, their voices booming across the table. And then someone says it. "Bring in the fool." That would be you. The great doors swing open, and suddenly all eyes turn. The laughter that filled the room quiets into an expectant hush. You step forward, bells jingling at your wrists and ankles, your motley bright and absurd in the candlelight. You are not here to dine. You are not here to relax. You are here to be served up. The main course of ridicule, plated in fabric and bells. The queen might smile indulgently as you enter. The king might chuckle, leaning on his elbow. But the courtiers, they are ready. They've had too much wine, their egos swollen with drink, and nothing delights them more than mocking someone below them. And you, fool, are here to make sure their laughter doesn't run dry. The humiliation begins subtly. A drunken nobleman orders you to sing. But not a sweet ballad, no, a bawdy tavern song, one you learned long before court life. You sing it, the words crude, the rhythm bouncing. The nobles roar with laughter, slapping the table, spilling wine onto their silk sleeves. Then someone demands a dance. You shuffle forward, bells jingling, twirling clumsily as they jeer. Another noble shouts for you to mimic the king's walk. You hesitate. Too much mockery might be dangerous, but the wine has loosened the king's mood, and he laughs when you exaggerate his stride. You are safe, for now. But then the darker side creeps in. A drunken hand grabs your arm, pulling you closer. Another pats your shaved head or tugs at your sleeve. Some female jesters, like you, endured groping and jeers as part of the entertainment. You are an object tonight, as much as the golden goblets or the roasted pig. Imagine it. You're shoved into the center of the hall, the floor sticky with spilled wine, the heat of the fire pressing against your back. Nobles crowd around, their faces flushed, their laughter sharp. You dance, you sing, you tumble. You keep moving because if you stop, if you show anger or shame or fear, the laughter will twist. They will mock you harder, or worse, they will punish you for spoiling the fun. This is the cruelty of feast day humiliation. You are both the entertainer and the scapegoat. If the wine is bad, blame the fool. If the food is cold, mock the fool. If the mood sours, shove the fool back into the center and demand more tricks. You are the court sponge, soaking up every drop of irritation and turning it into laughter. For men, this was degrading enough. For women, it was doubled. Nobles could leer openly, mocking not only your performance, but your very body. You might be forced to sing love songs, your voice rising over the jeers, while courtiers made crude comments. You had no right to protest. You were the fool. That was the job. And yet, strange as it sounds, these humiliations sometimes gave you an edge. By being the target of their ridicule, you gained a kind of freedom. No one else in that hall could mimic the king without losing their head. No one else could sing a tavern ballad without shaming their family. But you could. And while they laughed at you, you slipped in truths, little barbs hidden in the rhyme. My lord drinks like a fish. Pity the fish have better manners. The hall explodes with laughter. Even the drunken nobleman laughs, though his face reddens. You've turned their mockery back on them, safely hidden in jest. But don't romanticize it too much. These feasts were exhausting. Imagine hours of it, the endless roar of laughter, the stink of wine on noble's breath, the ache in your feet from dancing on stone floors. You collapse into bed at dawn, the bells still echoing faintly in your ears, your body sore, your pride long since stripped away. Let's paint the picture clearly. The candles flicker low, casting shadows on the walls. The banquet table is strewn with bones and half-eaten loaves. Nobles slouch in their chairs, dozing or snoring. And you, the fool, stand there, sweaty, hoarse, humiliated. The night's entertainment is over and you've survived. But tomorrow it begins again. This was the reality of feast day humiliation. Every banquet was a gamble. You could make them laugh, and they would shower you with scraps, wine, even gifts, or you could falter, and they would turn on you, their laughter sharp and cruel, their scorn unbearable. For a female fool, this was your daily stage. You lived on display, your dignity stripped for their amusement, your wit, your only defense. You kept them laughing, because laughter was survival. And in those rare moments when your jokes landed just right, when you mocked a nobleman and he laughed along with everyone else, you tasted the smallest victory. A victory not of status or respect, but of endurance. So the next time you picture a medieval feast, don't imagine only the glittering gowns and golden platters. Picture the fool in the center of it all. Picture the bells jingling, the candles flickering, the roasted meat steaming. Picture the laughter, some warm, some cruel, echoing against stone walls. And picture yourself there, smiling, bowing, humiliated, yet somehow surviving. That was feast day life for a female jester. You were the joke, the scapegoat, the relief from tension. And whether they mocked you kindly or cruelly, you kept going. Because in that hall, surrounded by power and pride, your survival depended on it. Not all fools were created equal. And if you, by some twist of fate, became a female fool, chances are you weren't brought in to amuse the king directly. More often, you were attached to the queen. On paper, this might sound like a softer role. Less dangerous, perhaps. After all, the queen wasn't out swinging swords or making war, but life at her side had its own sharp edges. Queens lived under constant scrutiny, judged for every word, every dress, every child they bore or failed to bear. Their households could be lonely, filled with stiff ladies-in-waiting who curtsied more than they conversed. And so a fool, a woman who could poke fun, make mischief, break the suffocating etiquette, was a valuable companion. That's where you come in. You are more than the clown in the corner. You are the queen's pressure valve, the one person allowed to break the rules of silence. When the atmosphere grows heavy, you tumble in with a joke. When the queen is brooding, you tease her out of it. And when court politics grow sharp, you whisper truths in her ear that her advisors never could. Take Archwood de Poix, fool to Queen Jane of France. Jane didn't just keep Archwood around for amusement. She clothed her lavishly, even paying 170 gold francs for a single dress. That's the kind of gown noble women dreamed about, stitched in silk, dripping with embroidery. And yes, Archwood wore it not as a sign of dignity, but as a walking contradiction. Imagine the laughter. A fool in a gown fit for a duchess. Here's the sarcasm that history refuses to admit. Yes, you're technically mocked, but also better dressed than half the nobility. Every time Archwood swept into a room in her expensive dress, the courtiers were reminded of their place. You might be a fool, but you were the queen's fool, and that gave you a kind of protection. For queens, a female fool wasn't just entertainment, it was subtle power. Through you, they could say the unsayable. You could mock a king's temper when the queen could only smile politely. You could tease a minister's incompetence when the queen was expected to nod in silence. You became a mouthpiece for the thoughts she couldn't express without scandal. But don't be fooled into thinking serving a queen was easier. You were still property, still the pet who had to perform at a moment's notice. You could be dressed in gold, yes, but you could also be slapped or shoved aside if your joke fell flat. The finery was not respect, it was costume. Yet in the court's endless theater, being at the queen's side meant you were closer to influence than almost any other woman. Serving a king directly, on the other hand, was more perilous. Male jesters often found themselves in this role, mocking rulers to their faces, sometimes even influencing decisions. For a woman, the risks multiplied. The king's hall was rowdy, filled with men eager to jeer and test the fool's boundaries. One clever remark could win a king's favor. One misstep could lead to punishment, or worse, accusations that you'd overstepped your gender. So you see the divide. The queen's fool was a companion, a confidant wrapped in bells. She could ease loneliness, break silence, even slip truths past the suffocating etiquette of royal life. The king's fool was a lightning rod, mocked by men, humiliated for sport, but granted dangerous access to power. Both roles carried humiliation. Both required wit sharpened by survival. But for a woman, the queen's household was usually the safer cage. Imagine yourself in that world. By day, you trail the queen through her chambers, making sly observations as she writes letters or tries on jewels. By night, you sit at her feet in the great hall, dressed finer than courtiers, but still expected to tumble at her command. The courtiers whisper about you, half mocking, half envious. And as you bow low, you allow yourself a thought. You may be a fool, but you are also in the room where power happens. That was the paradox of the female fool. You were both ridiculed and rewarded, both mocked and protected, both silenced and, through jokes, able to speak. So the question is, if you had to choose, would you rather serve the king, risking your life with every jest, or the queen, where your humiliation came wrapped in velvet and gold? Either way, your survival was stitched into the motley you wore, your power disguised in laughter. One of the strangest things about being a female jester is that you are at once the most visible person in the room and the most invisible. The bells on your sleeves announce your presence with every step. The garish motley marks you out like a painted target. Everyone sees you, everyone laughs at you, and yet no one notices you. That invisibility, as humiliating as it was, could be a dangerous kind of power. Because while the nobles snickered at your songs and mocked your clumsy tumbles, they forgot something. You were listening, always listening. Imagine the scene. You're perched on a stool by the fire in a drafty hall. The nobles are gathered at the far end, speaking in lowered voices about alliances, betrayals, debts. You hum softly to yourself, head bowed, your bells jingling faintly. They think you're a fool. What would you understand of politics? But you do understand. Every word, every whispered threat, every secret deal, they drift into your ears as if carried on the smoke from the fire. And later, when the queen leans close and asks, "What were they saying?" you repeat it all, wrapped in a joke. That was the real secret of jesters, male or female. They were informants as much as entertainers. But for women, the espionage was even subtler. Because society didn't take you seriously, you could slip between conversations like a shadow. The courtiers lowered their guard around you, laughing at your absurd costume, never imagining that the idiot at the hearth was memorizing every word. Take the case of the female fool at Edward II's court in 1316. During Whitsuntide celebrations, she rode into the hall on horseback, bells jingling, cracking jokes to the delight of the king and his guests. And then, at the height of the performance, she did something extraordinary. She handed the king a letter. On the surface, it was a joke, part of the act. But inside, it was a petition, a complaint against the favoritism Edward lavished on certain courtiers, while loyal knights were ignored. No one else would have dared. Only a fool could get away with it. The joke gave her cover. The motley was her disguise. She delivered the truth wrapped in laughter, and the king took it. Now think about that. A woman in bells, considered little more than a toy, managed to smuggle political criticism directly into the king's hand. Try to imagine one of Edward's ministers doing that. He'd have been accused of treason, but a fool was harmless. That was the irony. The more they mocked you, the more space you had to maneuver. It's not hard to see why rulers valued their jesters. The court was a place of masks, smiles concealing envy, flattery hiding ambition. Everyone wanted something from the king or queen, but no one dared speak plainly. Except you. Your motley gave you license. Your invisibility gave you access. You could lean close to the queen, whisper something sharp, and she could laugh it off as nonsense, or take it as a warning. You became the one honest voice in a palace full of liars. But honesty was always dangerous. Espionage was not without risk. Say too much, repeat the wrong secret, deliver the wrong joke, and suddenly your invisibility vanished. You were noticed. And being noticed in that context could mean ruin. A noble who felt betrayed could accuse you of slander. A king who disliked your message could have you punished. Spies were useful, but also disposable. So you learned to cloak your truths carefully. You wrapped them in riddles, metaphors, and rhymes. The rooster crows, but the fox already knows where the hens are kept. To a drunk nobleman, it was nonsense. To the queen, it was a warning about betrayal in the treasury. You spoke in layers, letting the sharpest meanings fall only into the ears prepared to hear them. Think of yourself, late at night, walking the palace corridors. The torches gutter. The stone walls echo with footsteps. Servants slip by, heads bowed. You pass unnoticed. After all, you're only the fool. But in your head, you carry the secrets of kings and courtiers, tucked away like jewels. You know who is plotting, who is scheming, who is desperate. You are the invisible ear of the palace, the hidden tongue of the queen. And perhaps, if you were clever enough, you used that knowledge for survival. A whispered warning here, a mocking jest there, reminding the queen of a rival's greed, slipping a barb at a banquet about a nobleman's unpaid debts. They laugh, they jeer, but they also remember. And in remembering, they act differently. You've shaped the politics of the court, all while pretending you don't understand a thing. But let's not romanticize it too much. You are still a fool. Your espionage is tolerated only because it amuses. The moment you appear too clever, too knowing, the spell breaks. You are no longer harmless. And harmlessness is your only shield. That's the cruel irony. You survive by being underestimated, by leaning into the mockery, by making yourself invisible, even while standing in plain sight. So when you think of female jesters, don't just picture them tumbling for laughter at feasts. Picture them in the shadows, listening at the edges of power, weaving gossip into jokes, hiding truths in riddles. Picture the woman on horseback at Edward II's feast, letter in hand, disguising dissent as comedy. Picture Mathurine, whispering warnings to Henry IV, her costume bright enough to distract from the sharpness of her tongue. Invisibility, it turns out, was its own form of armor. It let you walk among lions without being eaten, at least not immediately. And while the courtiers laughed at your bells and your motley, they never realized that you were hearing everything and remembering more than they ever intended. That was the true double life of the female fool, mocked in the hall, but moving like a shadow through the corridors of power. You've just heard the secrets she wasn't meant to keep. If you don't subscribe, her voice drops back into whispers no one hears. Now let's talk about feelings, or rather, your complete lack of permission to have any. As a female jester, you are allowed to laugh, to grin, to tumble and sing. But sadness, anger, illness, no. Those don't fit into the job description. Your role is laughter, and laughter only. Anything else, anything real, was considered treason against the mood of the court. Imagine it. Your mother has just died. You've received word from the village where you grew up. The grief is raw, the kind that catches in your throat when you breathe. But the queen summons you to her chamber. She's pacing, irritated by some political squabble. You shuffle in, bells tinkling at your wrists. She looks at you expectantly, and in that moment, your grief doesn't matter. Sarcasm says it best. Your mother died? Tell a pun about it. That's your job. It sounds cruel, and it was. The jester's life demanded the constant wearing of a mask, and for women, the mask was even heavier, because society already expected you to be silent, compliant, and cheerful. Add the role of fool, and those expectations hardened into iron. You were there to make others feel better, never yourself. Let's picture another scene. You are sick. Fever burns in your skin. Your head aches. Your body begs for rest. But tonight, there is a banquet. The nobles are restless. The king is irritable. The call goes out. Bring in the fool. And so you go, dragging your aching body across the stone floor, bells jingling with each faltering step. No one notices your flushed face or your trembling hands. They see only the performance. You dance, you sing, you fall to the floor in a mock stumble, and they roar with laughter. You cough into your sleeve, but the show goes on. Because your illness is not permitted to exist, not in this palace. And heartbreak, that was perhaps the cruelest of all. Some fools, male and female, fell in love. A servant, a minstrel, another courtier. But what happened when that love ended? When betrayal stung or death took them? You were still expected to make others laugh. You were never allowed to crumble. The fool's heart was supposed to be unbreakable, or at least unimportant. For women, this meant that your emotional mask had two layers. The first was the motley itself, the visible costume of laughter and ridicule. The second was invisible but heavier, the forced cheer, the eternal smile, the refusal of dignity. You turned your pain into punchlines. You buried your rage under rhymes. You transformed tears into tricks. And the court adored it, because while they were free to sulk, brood, rage, or grieve, your only acceptable response was humor. They could mourn publicly with black cloth and solemn rituals. You mourned privately, in silence, if at all. Here's the irony. Your own suffering often made your jokes sharper. The pain you carried gave depth to the humor, even if the courtiers never noticed. They laughed at the surface, never realizing the bitterness that gave the joke its sting. That was your private rebellion, the fact that your comedy was born from tragedy. Let's linger in the hall for a moment. The nobles are restless, gossiping about wars and taxes. The king's mood is sour. The air is heavy, the candles sputtering. Then you step forward, grinning, bells jingling. You toss out a joke about the treasury being emptier than a monk's wine cup. The hall erupts. For a moment, you've shifted the atmosphere, cracked the gloom. They cheer, they laugh, they slap their goblets on the table. No one realizes you're doing it while your heart is breaking inside. That's the emotional mask at work, making everyone else feel lighter while you carry the weight. And make no mistake, it was exhausting. The mask never came off. Even in private, you were expected to keep the persona. Servants whispered, nobles stared. If you weren't laughing, they assumed something was wrong. You didn't belong to yourself anymore. You belonged to the role. But, as always, there was a strange twist of power in this humiliation. Because by hiding your own emotions, you became the vessel for everyone else's. The queen leaned on you when she was lonely. The king demanded your jokes when he was angry. The courtiers needed your laughter when they grew bored. You carried their emotions for them, turned them into something bearable, even if it meant suffocating your own. It was a kind of alchemy, turning grief into humor, rage into comedy, exhaustion into performance. And while it slowly chipped away at you, it also gave you influence. Because the court depended on you more than they admitted. You were the one who lifted the mood, soothed the tempers, and distracted from the failures. They laughed at you, yes, but they needed you. So there you stand, a woman in motley, bells jingling, a grin plastered on your face. No one sees the tears you swallow. No one notices the pain in your chest. They see only the laughter, the spectacle, the fool. And as you bow, as you deliver your final pun of the evening, you remind yourself of the unspoken rule carved into your life. Your emotions don't matter. Only theirs do. That was the emotional mask of the female fool. Not silk, not velvet, not even motley. It was the invisible mask you wore every day, hiding your pain behind laughter, your grief behind jest, your humanity behind bells. By now, you've learned that words are your only weapon. You don't carry a sword, you don't wear armor. You have bells on your sleeves and motley stitched in chaos. But hidden inside your jokes is something sharper than any blade. Truth. And truth, in a medieval court, was dynamite. The most famous example is Mathurine of France, Jester to Henry IV. One day, a man condemned to death begged for his life. Everyone expected silence. But Mathurine, wrapped in her colorful costume, stepped forward. With a well-timed jest, half humor, half plea, she persuaded the king to spare him. A life saved by laughter. Think about that. Ministers with titles couldn't sway the king. Nobles with power didn't dare try. But a woman in bells could. That is the strange, perilous privilege of the fool. Your words matter. They can save lives, change moods, even shift politics. But here's the catch. They have to be disguised, wrapped in satire, softened with laughter. Because if they aren't, they become dangerous. Here's your daily gamble. A joke too mild is useless. The court chuckles, but nothing changes. A joke too sharp is deadly. The laughter dies, the king's face hardens, and suddenly the guards are watching you with narrowed eyes. Your reward? Either applause or a public execution. No pressure. Picture it. The hall is tense after a military defeat. Nobles whisper, the king sulks. No one dares mention the disaster. But then you, fool, step into the silence. You grin, you jingle, and you say, well, at least the treasury's lighter now. Saves the servants' backs, carrying all that non-existent gold. Laughter explodes. The tension breaks. The king exhales, shaking his head. You've survived. For tonight. But what if he hadn't laughed? What if the sting was too close, the truth too raw? That same line could have ended in chains, banishment, or worse. That's the razor you walk every time you open your mouth. And remember, you're not just balancing humor and danger, you're balancing gender. For a male fool, a sharp remark might be forgiven as boys being boys. For you, a woman, too much wit, too much bite. And suddenly you're not just insolent, you're scandalous, or suspicious, or in the darkest cases, whispered about as unnatural, even accused of sorcery. So you learn the art of calibration. You test the room like a musician tuning an instrument. Too soft and no one hears. Too loud and the string snaps. You hover right in the middle, slipping truths disguised as nonsense. The courtiers laugh, never realizing they're swallowing medicine in honey. And yet, the danger is constant. Imagine being Mathurine, speaking up in a hall full of men with swords, her life balanced on the king's whim. Imagine Jane Foole, teasing nobles under the watchful eyes of 3 different Tudor queens, each with tempers and politics of their own. Every line was a calculation, every jest a wager with fate. And what did you get in return? Not glory, not safety, only survival. A few coins, a few gowns, maybe a meal at the table's edge. You risked your life with every quip, and your reward was being laughed at harder. Here's the irony. The court never admitted how much they relied on you. They needed your truths, hidden in laughter. They needed someone to say what no minister dared, to puncture the bubble of pride that kept rulers blind. And so, while they mocked you, they also listened. They remembered your barbs. They adjusted their actions. And sometimes, they even spared lives. But don't mistake that for gratitude. The fool's privilege was never guaranteed. It was borrowed time, a fragile arrangement. The king might laugh today and scowl tomorrow. The queen might clap at your rhyme tonight and find it insolent in the morning. Your entire existence was a gamble, and you never knew which way the dice would fall. So, there you are, a woman in motley, standing in the center of the hall. The courtiers roar with laughter, their wine spilling onto the stone floor. The king chuckles, shaking his head. For tonight, you've won. Your words have landed, sharp enough to amuse, not sharp enough to wound. But tomorrow, the balance begins again. That was the life of the female fool. Every performance a wager, every jest a risk, and every truth, no matter how carefully disguised, a dangerous spark in a hall soaked with pride. If there was one perk to being a fool, especially a female fool, it was this. Unlike almost every other woman in medieval society, you had access. Access to the king, access to the queen, access to conversations that would have been forbidden to you in any other role. Think about it. Most women couldn't even leave their homes without permission. Their lives were bound to fathers, husbands, sons. But you jingled your way right into the great hall. You sat at the queen's feet, or even leaned over the king's shoulder, your words delivered with a grin. No lady-in-waiting could speak so freely. No noblewoman could mock a duke to his face. But you could. That was your rare privilege, free speech disguised as folly. And sometimes it paid off, literally. Some fools were rewarded with gifts, land, even titles for family members. Roland the Farter, a male jester, was famously given an estate for his performance. But women, too, occasionally benefited. Archwood Depoy received gowns worth more than most merchants earned in a year. Jane Foole had shoes, dozens of them, lavishly gifted by queens. Imagine that. Peasants trudged barefoot through mud, while the fool of the court strutted in silk slippers. Yes, you were mocked. Yes, you were humiliated. But your wardrobe outshone half the nobility. Of course, gifts weren't always about generosity. They were about ownership. That dress, that necklace, that pair of shoes. It wasn't a token of respect. It was a reminder. You belong to us. We clothe you. We feed you. We can take it all away whenever we like. Still, there was a peculiar freedom in the role. A servant could be dismissed at a moment's notice. A wife could be locked away or beaten. But you, fool, were harder to erase. You were woven into the daily life of the court. The queen needed you to ease her loneliness. The king needed you to break his temper. The nobles needed you as their scapegoat. You had, in your absurd costume, a kind of job security most women could never dream of. And let's not forget mobility. While ordinary women were tethered to hearth and household, jesters sometimes traveled with monarchs. You might ride in a carriage behind the queen, or even trot alongside soldiers in the king's retinue. You saw castles, towns, and courts far beyond the reach of peasant women. Your bells jingled not just in one hall, but across kingdoms. But here comes the sarcasm. Don't confuse privileges with respect. Your shoes might be velvet, but they still jingled like mockery. Your speech might be free, but only because no one took it seriously. You were not admired for your wisdom, not honored for your bravery. You were tolerated, laughed at, paraded like an exotic bird in a gilded cage. Imagine this contradiction. You, the fool, are allowed to stand closer to the queen than her ladies. You whisper jokes in her ear, and she smiles. Yet the same courtiers who envy your closeness also jeer at your shaved head, your motley gown, your bells. You are near power, but never of power. You are dressed like nobility, but treated like property. You are given privileges, but denied dignity. And yet, don't underestimate how extraordinary this was. For a woman in the Middle Ages, silence was the default. The rare privilege of jesters was not just proximity to monarchs, but the chance to be heard. Your jokes, your rhymes, your songs, they slipped past the walls of etiquette and lodged themselves in the ears of kings and queens. They might laugh at you, but they also remembered you. And in remembering, sometimes they acted differently. Think again of Mathurine persuading Henry IV to spare a man's life, or the nameless fool who handed Edward II a petition. Those were privileges in action, not gifts of land or gold, but the ability to shape decisions. And for women who had no political voice, that was revolutionary. Of course, you couldn't boast about it. You couldn't strut around declaring your influence. That would shatter the illusion. Your power only worked as long as everyone believed you had none. The second they thought you too clever, too knowing, the privileges vanished. That was the constant tension. You had access, but never ownership. Speech, but never authority. Gifts, but never honor. So here's the paradox you lived with daily. You were freer than most women in your world, and yet still chained by ridicule. You walked beside queens, but never as their equal. You laughed with kings, but never as their friend. You had privileges other women could only dream of, but they came wrapped in humiliation, never respect. Picture it. You sit at the edge of the queen's dais, dressed in motley but draped in silk. Nobles cast jealous glances, whispering about your shoes or your jewels. You make a quip. The queen laughs. The tension in the hall breaks. For a fleeting moment, you feel powerful. Then a nobleman smirks and tosses a chicken bone at you. the hall roars with laughter. And just like that, you're reminded, your privileges will never outweigh your humiliation. That was the bargain of the female fool. Access without dignity, gifts without respect, power without recognition. And yet, you kept going, because in a world where most women had no voice at all, you found a way to speak, even if it was through bells and laughter. Every role has its curtain call, and for the female jester, the curtain began to fall in the 17th century. The bells grew quiet, the motley faded, and the women who once stood at the center of royal laughter slowly vanished from the record books. Why? Because courts were changing. By the 1600s, European monarchies were growing more formal, more polished, more obsessed with dignity. Kings and queens no longer wanted fools jingling in their halls, mocking their vanity in front of foreign ambassadors. They wanted majesty, not mockery. Ceremony replaced laughter. Theater became professionalized, and with it, the fool, the figure who once thrived in the in-between, was pushed aside. Imagine yourself at court during this shift. You've spent years perfecting your craft, tumbling, jesting, rhyming your way through tension. But now, instead of calling for the fool, the king calls for an opera singer. Instead of a bawdy jest, the queen prefers a scripted mask performed by trained actors in costume. You're still there, bells jingling faintly at your sleeves, but the audience isn't laughing anymore. They're watching the stage. You've gone from centerpiece to relic. For female jesters, the decline was even swifter. There had never been many of you to begin with, just fragments scattered across Europe, Archwood de Poix, whispering wit into Queen Jean's ear. Mathurine, dazzling in motley and saving lives with satire. Jane Foole, bald-headed and brightly dressed, drifting through Tudor portraits like a ghost. But as the role of the fool collapsed, the women vanished almost without a trace. Their names, already rare, disappeared into silence. Take Jane Foole. She had lived through 3 queens, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Parr, Mary Tudor. She was painted into portraits, recorded in household accounts, gifted gowns and shoes fit for nobility. And then, nothing. After Mary Tudor's reign, Jane Foole fades into history's fog. No one records her death. No one marks her grave. A woman once close to the most powerful people in England, erased as if she had never existed at all. And she wasn't alone. Most female jesters were remembered only in passing references. One line in an account book, a mention in a letter, a scribbled note about a dress or a joke. Their lives were lived in full color, bells jingling, motley flashing, yet history preserved them only as faint echoes. You were vivid while you lived, but forgotten the moment you stopped making them laugh. Why? Because the fool's role was always precarious. You were never meant to be remembered. Kings had chronicles, queens had portraits, nobles had genealogies. Fools had none of that. Your entire life was built on performance, and performances vanish the moment the audience goes home. Once the feasts ended and the bells stopped jingling, there was nothing left to anchor you in memory. There's a bitter irony in that. The female fool had more freedom than most women of her age. She could speak truths others couldn't, walk in halls other women never saw, mock men who thought themselves untouchable. She lived at the heart of power, closer to kings and queens than most ministers. And yet, she left almost no trace, forgotten faster than a servant, more invisible in death than in life. Picture it like this. You stand in a grand hall, surrounded by nobles who laugh and cheer as you deliver your final joke. The candles burn low, The air smells of wine and smoke. You bow, bells jingling. Tomorrow, you'll do it again, and the day after that. Until one day, you don't. Perhaps you grow sick. Perhaps the queen dies, and her fool is dismissed. Perhaps you simply fade from the court, slipping back into the obscurity from which you came. The halls go on without you. The laughter moves on. The record books don't bother to note your absence. That's how the end came, not with scandal, not with execution, not even with drama, simply with silence. The motley was folded away. The bells stopped ringing. The female fool, once tolerated as a bright contradiction, no longer had a place in the new age of powdered wigs and velvet ceremony. But here's the truth worth remembering. Though history erased their names, the impact of female jesters lingers. They were proof that women, even in the strictest, most suffocating courts, could carve out a space for speech. They used laughter as survival, wit as resistance, ridicule as camouflage. They were mocked, yes, but they were also listened to. And for centuries, in palaces that silenced almost every other woman, fools spoke. And now, centuries later, you are here, imagining yourself in their shoes. Those velvet slippers Jane Foole was gifted. Those ridiculous boots that jingled with bells. You picture yourself in motley, standing in halls heavy with power. You feel the sting of their humiliation, the weight of their survival. And in that act of remembering, you're giving them what history refused. A voice that lasts beyond the echo of laughter. So yes, the female fool faded. The records dwindled. Jane Foole disappears after Mary Tudor. Mathurine's final years vanish into rumor. Archwood is mentioned once, then gone. But for a brief, fragile moment in history, they danced in motley, mocked kings and queens, and spoke truths in disguise. And even if their names are whispers now, the fact that they existed at all is enough to unsettle the silence of the past. The end of the female fool was quiet, but the memory of her is not gone, not entirely, not as long as you're listening. So, here you are. The bells have stopped jingling, the motley is folded away, and history has politely tried to sweep you under the rug. And yet, we're still talking about you. Centuries later, your life echoes in whispers, fragments, footnotes. You were never supposed to be remembered, and yet, here we are. The female jester is a paradox. You were mocked, yet powerful. You were free, yet trapped. You were a spectacle, but also a shadow. The court dressed you in ridiculous colors, shaved your head, and laughed at you. But beneath all that humiliation, you wielded something extraordinary, the right to speak. Let's be honest, that was no small thing. In a world where most women were silenced, where even queens had to measure every word, you, the fool, could speak truths aloud, wrapped in satire, tucked inside riddles, disguised as nonsense, but spoken nonetheless. You were the mirror the court didn't want, but couldn't ignore. And mirrors, as you know, can be uncomfortable. You reflected the fragility of male power. Kings and dukes strutted around in silk and armor, pretending to be untouchable. And then you came along, bells jingling, and reduced them to a punchline. They laughed because they had to. But in that laughter, they saw themselves for what they really were. Human, flawed, ridiculous. That was your real legacy. Not the motley, not the bells, not the bawdy songs or the drunken banquets. Your legacy was the reminder that power is fragile, and laughter can expose it more effectively than rebellion. Think of Mathurine, bold in her motley, daring to mock kings while persuading them to acts of mercy. Think of Jane Foole, shaved bald, yet dressed in gowns finer than most noble women. A walking contradiction whose very presence unsettled the order of things. Think of the unnamed fool at Edward II's court, daring to hand him a petition wrapped in a joke. These women were not remembered as warriors or queens, but they were truth-tellers in disguise. And here's the irony that would make even you laugh. The very thing that made them safe to kings, their absurdity, was what made them dangerous. Because no one takes a fool seriously, which meant a fool could say anything. That's the paradox of your existence. You were powerless, yet feared, ridiculed, yet envied. Silenced as a woman, yet given more freedom to speak than almost any woman of your age. You were an anomaly, a loophole in a rigid world. And while history may have forgotten your names, it cannot erase what you represented, the possibility of speech in a world of silence. Now, step back and imagine yourself again at court. The hall is glowing with candlelight, nobles buzzing with gossip, the king restless on his throne. You step forward, motley flashing, bells jingling. They laugh at you, mock you, jeer at you. But then, with one sharp line, you cut through their pride. The hall erupts. They think it's just laughter, but you know it's more. You've reminded them that their power is not absolute. You've cracked the illusion. For one moment, the mighty are reduced to mortals, and all it took was a joke. That's the legacy of the female fool. You were not queens. You did not rule kingdoms, but you shaped them in small, sharp ways. You softened tempers, saved lives, spread truths. You reminded rulers of their own fragility. And centuries later, we are still remembering you, not because history wanted to, but because you refused to vanish. Sarcasm fits best here. You were never supposed to be remembered, and yet, here we are, talking about you centuries later. And maybe that's the greatest joke of all. Because legacy, in the end, isn't always about monuments or statues. Sometimes it's about whispers. Sometimes it's about fragments that survive in letters and account books. Sometimes it's about stories told centuries later, in dark rooms, to listeners drifting off to sleep. Your bells may have rusted, your motley may have rotted, but your story still rings out. You weren't meant to endure, but you did. So, as you drift deeper into this tale, think about what the female jester really left behind. Not just laughter, not just humiliation, but proof that even in the harshest of worlds, women found ways to be heard. They laughed in the face of power, and somehow they survived. That survival is their gift to us. Their legacy is more than a joke. It's a reminder that truth can hide in laughter, that power can be mocked, that even the silenced can find a voice. And you, yes, you lying there in the quiet, are proof of it, because you're still listening, still remembering, still carrying their voices forward. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to turn their humiliation into something else entirely. Not just survival, not just mockery, but memory. The one thing kings and queens couldn't control. And so, the bells fall silent. The motley is folded away. The female fool steps out of the hall and into history's shadows, half forgotten, half remembered, and yet, somehow, still here with us tonight. What does her story leave you with? Perhaps this, that life isn't measured in the applause that fades, or in the bells that rust. It isn't measured in the laughter of drunken nobles, or in the scraps tossed from a king's table. It's measured in dignity. Dignity you get to keep, even when the world tries to strip it away. You don't live in her time. You don't have to bow at midnight because a queen is restless. You don't have to laugh through grief or juggle while your heart is breaking. Be glad you're not expected to turn your sorrow into slapstick or to dance in a hall of jeers just to keep your place at the table. Gentle sarcasm serves us best here. Be glad you're not expected to juggle through grief in a hat with bells. Yet, there's a lesson tucked inside her motley, that even in humiliation, there was resistance. Even in ridicule, there was wit. And even in a world determined to silence women, there were those who found a way to speak. Perhaps not with the respect they deserved. Perhaps not with the permanence of queens and kings. But they spoke, and we are still listening. So as you drift off tonight, let the noise of their halls fade into quiet. Let the candles gutter out. Let the feasts and laughter dissolve into the dark. What remains isn't the jeering or the motley or the bells. What remains is endurance, the quiet strength of survival. Close your eyes. Let the story settle like dust after a feast. The fools are gone. The halls are empty. The bells are quiet now. All that's left is sleep. And if you found your way here, still listening after all these hours, then their voices, mocked, muffled, almost lost, have lasted just a little longer. And maybe that's the real punchline. The joke was on history, because the fool was never as foolish as she seemed, and neither is this channel. If you like and subscribe, you're not just supporting me, you're making sure these forgotten voices aren't laughed out of history a second time. And if you'd like to carry these stories with you beyond tonight, you can. As you drift off, remember, you can take them ad-free anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness Volume 1, is available now, and it even includes a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released for this first run, and the link is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment. Sleep well, and thank you for keeping these forgotten voices alive.